رب العالمين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين.
G'day and Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. I'm Glyn McLean and my genetics are primarily Scottish with a little bit of Irish and a bit of Jewish blood. My clans are Clan Gillian, McLean of Duart, which is on my father's side, and on my mother's side it's Clan Keith. My mum's people arrived in New Zealand in 1860 in Oamaru, and they were farmers and blacksmiths primarily. My dad arrived here in 1957, nearly 100 years later, in Wellington, and I have 3 brothers and a sister, most of whom live overseas now, and we shifted all over New Zealand. I went to 12 different schools. My parents met through the Methodist Church here in Wellington, and for my very early childhood, we always said grace at meals. We went to church. My parents went to church. The kids, we went to Sunday school. But at one point, I think when I was about 8 or 9, or one of the times we shifted, I think when we went to Turangi, we just simply didn't get enrolled at Sunday school, and my parents didn't go to church, and we stopped saying grace. And I never found out why. I've never actually asked. So from then on, my upbringing was pretty much very secular, although I tended to gravitate to friends, particularly at school, who were people who had a lot of faith, from various Christian denominations primarily. My attitude was always to them was, I respect your faith, but don't try and convert me, which they were all very good about. Although there was, it wasn't actually till I came to Wellington in the 1980s, after I finished university, that I discovered how important church was actually to my parents. I joined a drama group that I literally picked out of the phone book, which was actually the drama group attached to the Wesley Church, and found that not only were both my parents members, but 2 of my uncles were also founding members. And I didn't know this. One of the women there said to me, first thing she asked was, what church do you go to? And I said, well, I don't. And she said, why is that? And I said, well, I have absolutely no doubt that there is a God, but I just don't feel at all comfortable with many of the teachings that I've come across, and so I don't go to a church. And she just smiled and said, God will bring you to him when he's ready, in his own way, which I thought was pretty cool. Well, how I came to Islam was not at all sort of the usual route from what I gather talking to many other people who have become Muslim. I went to school in New Zealand primarily in the 70s, and that was the era of the Cold War, the doomsday clock waiting for our atomic bombs to go off and world destruction, Carlist days, and this huge threat we were all told about of communism, that this red threat was going to take over New Zealand and the whole world. And the first New Zealand election that I remember was the infamous Dancing Cossacks election, where Mr Muldoon had these advertisements with Dancing Cossacks saying a vote for Labour was reds under the bed, and if we voted for Labour the whole country would become communist. And in the 1990s I began to notice that whereas the whole communist thing had sort of faded away with the collapse of the communist empires, that in the 1990s Islam was starting to be portrayed in a very similar manner, but with a very substantial difference. With the whole communism threat, we had a lot of information about, if you like, both sides of the stories. At school, we studied things like the Cultural Revolution in China. We could access Marx and Lenin and Trotsky if we wanted to. Animal Farm was on the New Zealand school curriculum. 1984, quite a lot of things actually dealt with the sort of whys and wherefores behind it. But with Islam in the 90s, there was nothing. There was just this great big threat. The colour had changed from red to black, but there was almost nothing else. Now, I made the decision to educate myself because I felt that it was, well, completely wrong to basically just have one set of information. And I decided the best way to go about that was to go to the source. I had studied quite a lot of other religions, and to get away from the sort of dogma of humans, and you get humans running organisation and politics, get involved in all sorts of things. So I always try to go to the most important sources for that faith. So I decided to read the Quran. That was easier said than done because I couldn't obtain a copy. There were none in the libraries. The bookshop said they couldn't get me any in. Now, I knew at that time that in Daniel Street in Newtown there was a house which said Wellington Islamic Centre. It was before we had the mosque. And I didn't doubt that I could wander down there and ask to borrow a Quran and someone would lend me one. I didn't because I was very aware that I didn't know how to behave. I didn't want to cause anybody offence. And I mean, I know how to behave on a marae. I know how to behave in a range of Christian churches, from Christadelphian to Catholic to Baptist. I know how to behave at a Samoan funeral, but I had absolutely no idea how to behave when communicating with Muslims, so I didn't do that. I eventually ordered a copy from Amazon.com, over the internet, and when it arrived, I expected it to be something completely foreign. I studied Japanese language at university, and I expected the Quran to be as foreign to my way of thinking and my entire upbringing as Japanese language is to English. And I was wrong. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I opened this up and started reading about all the stories that I'd been brought up with as a kid. There was Adam and Eve, there was Abraham, there was Hud, there was Jesus, there was Mary, peace be upon them. All the things that had been the cornerstones of my very early upbringing, and very much the sort of value systems that my family had. And yet they were told in a way that answered all the concerns I'd had previously. For example, the decision to take from the Tree of Knowledge. That was a joint decision. It wasn't some evil woman had actually come in and